Kia ora, I'm Ian Harvey, founder of Collective Intelligence, and this is Stuff That Matters Now. Nā mai hoki mai everyone. I am sitting down for my annual conversation with Rod Oram. Boy, have we got a lot to get through this year. I never know what Rod is going to put on the table to discuss. The selection to discuss what's been and what's coming for this year is going to be huge. Love talking to Rod, such a huge depth of knowledge, and really looking forward to seeing what his views are on and the areas we need to focus on. So enjoy this from a very, very wise, well-informed fella. Good morning, Rod Oram.
Well, Morena Harv, it's fabulous to be back with you again. I've lost track, although I have a short memory, of how many of these beginning of the year podcasts we've done. It is a number.
There is a number. It's about 3 or 4. We're not getting sick of each other yet, but give it time. We might achieve that this year. But I really look forward to these. It gives me a chance to get up to date, find out what's in your head and your brain. This is a year like no other. Once again, we say that every year, and just the pressure keeps on building. And I'm just going to kick off, Rod, and get you to open about what you want to talk about so we don't waste time, because there's a lot for us to get through. So what's going on in the world, Rod? What are you seeing happening? What are the trends, and how do they relate to New Zealand?
My very central preoccupation is that we have this escalating series of interconnected issues at play in the world. And each is making the other worse, and collectively so. But tantalizingly, the solution to one helps solve the others. However, the way humankind, in our economics, our politics, our society, our cultural drivers try to address all these things leads us down the same old dysfunctional roads all the time. So we've got to approach things very, very differently. And so that's my central preoccupation. That's what I do as a journalist, is try to be helpful on that. Both at that very big macro level, but then trying to sheet them right back to very practical solutions. So I'm going to run through a few in no particular order. Sorry, let me rephrase that, because you'll be editing it. I'm going to run through them in the order that people tend to think about things, but they're not the order they're most important. Okay. And I'll come back to what the order is. So the first one is economics. So we're in a real funk in New Zealand. In the most recent NZIER Business Sentiment Survey, it was its worst negative level in the 50 years that data has been running. But that makes absolutely no sense at all, because in 2022, we had the 4th highest GDP growth rate in the OECD at 6.4%. When Ardern took over as Prime Minister, our growth rate was 3%, which ranked us 19th in the OECD. And I could trot through a whole bunch of other stats that show that the economy is in remarkably good shape. We're even doing things like building houses. So the resource consent rate is now up to 8.9 homes per 1,000 people. And that's triple the rate it was when National was in government. So we are doing a whole thing, economically we're okay. And inflation is easing. Even as we talk, shortly there will be the latest inflation figure out. And it'll have backed off quite a lot from where the Reserve Bank have been forecasting it. Inflation isn't solved yet, but globally we're on the right track. So that's economics.
Then just on that, the 50-year slide and so forth, because that survey is it's an emotional survey. How are we feeling about the economy? It's not based on numbers. It's just It's amazing. It's like everybody's got this doom and gloom thing going on and starting to believe each other.
Absolutely. And I think what underlies that, and it's the transition into the politics, is that people no longer trust government and government no longer trusts people. That's a worldwide phenomenon, but we're seeing it here in New Zealand. And of course, government is far from the be-all and end-all. There is so much that's in the power of individual businesses to respond to these great opportunities out there in the world that they don't need the government to do. But I'm afraid I've always been shocked in the now 26 years almost I've been a New Zealander, how much business sentiment is shaped by their feelings about the government, which I think is completely crazy, because there's a whole bunch of stuff they could be doing, should be doing, can be doing, that's completely independent of the government, and they're too obsessed by government. And so it's this weird sense of, amongst business, of a loss of agency, that somehow they don't feel as though they're in control of their businesses anymore. But it's up to them to grab their businesses and their colleagues and work on stuff. And it's just plain not happening. I'm really worried about how we're falling behind. So that transitioned us into politics. And
number two?
Yeah, number two is politics. And so just as there's those global economic things at play, and they sheet home here in New Zealand, so I think we've gone through a period in politics which has been remarkably stable, say for the last 5 years, compared with elsewhere in the world. And one of the interesting parallels I've seen, and this was a piece we had in Newsroom just this morning from a leader writer from the Hindustan Times called Sushil Aron, who is a diplomat. He had been a political advisor to the British High Commission in New Delhi at some point. An interesting fellow. And the point he was making was that Obama was excellent on messaging and talked about, tried to bring more EQ to politics, if you like. But look what happened after. So Ardern, like Obama, was the master of the simple message, whether it was, it was be kind versus yes we can with Obama. And so I wonder how much her approach to being prime minister and being to politics kept at bay, at least for a while through our first lockdown, kept at bay these very, very destructive forces in politics. Now, we then saw them around the world. We then saw them bubble up during the occupation of the parliamentary grounds last year. And we're certainly seeing it in social media. So I've been really astonished by the examples I've seen on social media and by the analysis of the Disinformation Project, which is very well worth checking out here in New Zealand, very serious researchers about the impact of social media. So I'm really concerned that we're now heading into an even more corrosive period in politics that's going to be really whipped up through this year running up to the election in October.
And look, I've also heard from somebody inside the beehive, and they're apolitical, but saying that the spooks are really concerned this year about our election coming up and the influence of outside forces to destabilise a democratic country as much as possible coming to this election. And they don't know what to expect. And so this is now other nations now starting to try and affect our democracy. And they're trying to anticipate what that could be, and they're really concerned about it.
Absolutely. I'm plucking... No, I won't. So I was about to pluck an example out of the air, but I won't, because that will lead us down into conspiracy theories in itself. But it's a very real danger, because that's what's going on in the rest of the world. And it's too easy for us to say, we're only 5 million people and we're tucked away at the bottom of the South Pacific. But no, we're not. We do have a profile. we have a whole new era of geopolitics, and the US and China are fighting for global dominance, and we're a tiny pawn in that, and making an example of us in one way or another. Could be part of that game. We're far from immune to this. So I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I'm just putting stuff on the table, and then we can come back to discuss how we might deal with it. So that's 2 is politics. 3 is just society at large, which is an extension of that in terms of our ability as a very diverse nation. So, for example, here in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, about 45% of us who call this city our home were not born in New Zealand. And we get along pretty well. We've got the Lantern Festival coming up. We've just had Chinese New Year. Diwali was fabulous late last year and all this kind of stuff. But I think we're far too casual about that. We're nowhere near intentional enough about what it means to be a citizen of Aotearoa. And I think we've started something really important here. And I first saw it with our daughter when she was growing up. She had a wonderful range of friends and from quite different cultural backgrounds in her school. And what I found completely extraordinary about these girls was that it was an all-girls school, was that they were very appreciative of each other's culture and very comfortable engaging in each other's culture. I mean, Celeste did kapahaka, as enthusiastically as anybody. But they still retain their own identity. And this I found quite fascinating because it was quite a different approach to immigration and assimilation than I'd experienced in other countries. Like I grew up in the UK, and there you see terribly plummy people. If you only heard them on the BBC, Lord so-and-so from the House of Lords ennobled because they'd done something wonderful or paid a lot of money to a political party. You think, and indeed they'd gone to Oxford, but then you discover that their parents were immigrants from the Caribbean. So they'd been totally assimilated, acculturated into being British. But I think here in New Zealand we do something quite different, where we don't become just kind of this soup. We have this very strong Maori expression from tangata whenua, that when we're doing this right, we can engage comfortably with that. I'm terrible with te reo. I'm halting in it. I'm not learning it in an organised way. But I love the encouragement I get to use te reo to express some of the things I feel that feel differently because I'm here, as opposed to still being in England. So English no longer seems quite the right language to describe mountains and rivers. Aotearoa feels, more right, because language is so important. So what we do, we've got that, and I would hope that we still retain very strong home cultures, or our cultures of origin, if you like, for us immigrants, and find ways to make that work very well here. So that's society, but again, we have to do that in a very different way than we're doing now. And I'll come back to how we work together across all of these things. So that's the third one, and the fourth one is of course the most important one, but the one we're not thinking anywhere near enough, and it's about the living Earth, this planet, on which our entire ability to survive as humans depend. Now, at the risk of sounding like a boring old person, the year I was born was 1950. The population of the world was 2.5 billion people. That's the same population as India plus China today. In the almost 73 years I've been alive, the human population has more than trebled in my lifetime. We're now at 8 billion. My goal is to live to be 100, because life is far too interesting to check out any earlier, hence my email address nz2050.nz is every email's a little message to my 100th birthday. So we could be 10 billion people. So how on earth do 10 billion humans live in right relationship with this living planet? So that is climate change, that is ecosystems, it is resource use, it's our relationship to nature in all senses. It's about our ability to rewild places and to help protect species that are desperately threatened. It's all of those things. And again, I find that immensely exciting. And I'll just close that subject for having put it on the table with one last thought. In recent years, I've become a bit of a fan of cli-fi, climate fiction. I was always sort of admired science fiction for the huge intelligence and creativity of it, but I never kind of locked onto it very well. I saw Star Wars and but I was never deeply into it. But climate fiction is really, really, really interesting. There are some wonderful examples in climate fiction of people who are seeing the world and thinking about it in the ways they did with science fiction, but to give us insight about those futures that, for better or for worse, that we are capable of achieving. And so when I take a little time out from just sort of scanning news and analysis and everything else, it's not that I relax with cli-fi, but cli-fi just gives me that little bit of an extra perspective on things.
I've never heard the term. It's funny when you said, I went, oh God, I hope he explains what cli-fi is, because I know. And what's an example of cli-fi? These are movies. These are. How do they show up?
Well, my favourite example is the book Ministry for the Future, which is very much set in the in a relatively near future, not defined, but it works through the issues. Well, things have got really bad. So here was a new phrase I learnt, which is wet bulb temperatures. I'd never heard of such a thing.
Okay.
And that's a temperature which takes humidity into consideration as well. Because when a wet bulb temperature gets beyond body temperature, our bodies can no longer sweat. I mean, they sweat, but you don't evaporate, so you don't lose heat. And I went, wow, that's really a fascinating concept.
Sounds pretty scary.
And now we're starting to see wet bulb temperatures that are incompatible with human life. So in other words, you have to be in an air-conditioned environment. You have to get out of that temperature, out of that high humidity, high temperature. But then as Ministry of the Future unfolds, it's really exciting about how solutions emerge. And the one I found completely arresting, because it is immensely topical, is how to deal with oil companies. And so the Ministry of the Future conceives this, which is a global organisation, conceives of this idea of, in essence, quantitative easing for oil producers. Pay them not to produce. And I thought, no, that's completely unreasonable, because look at it, they've already made too much money. Why give them more? But the point is that if they were paid not to produce, that would end their argument that they have a right to still keep making money from producing oil and gas and coal. But it's then very interesting is how they might deploy that money. So bear with me on a historical connection here. I only learnt this a couple of years ago from my very wonderful older sister in the UK. The British government a couple of years ago finally paid off all the debt it took to buy out British slave owners in the early 19th century.
Well,
and it had been on the books that long. The London School of Economics has a whole project on this. You can go and look it all up. And as I did after she mentioned it. And of course, a lot of that money was very badly spent. People wildly wealthy built fantastic new stately homes and led very disciplined lives. Smart money put money into canals and then quickly into railroads. And it became really important, a really major point of seed capital for the Industrial Revolution.
So the slave traders thought, okay, so we can't do this anymore, but we've got a pocket full of money.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do now?
Yep. And quite a high proportion spent it very badly.
Yep.
But a good proportion have spent that money really well. And I thought, actually, I'm beginning to warm up to this idea, as unpalatable as it is. We should just be able to marshal arguments or laws to stop these people producing oil, gas, and coal. So that's the kind of really creative thinking that comes through for me in Cli-Fi. And it's this, delightful thing where we can imagine other worlds, other ways of doing things, and then work them out, if you like, in fiction, to help us then see how we might apply them in reality.
Okay, so here is something I've been toying with, which is sort of on the same subject, and it comes from what the Dutch are doing and saying, okay, we're going to stop. We're producing too much food. We've had too much responsibility producing food for the world. We don't want that anymore. And, of course, it doesn't please everybody, but they seem to be pretty committed to the idea of returning large parts of farming land back into natural areas. And I've been thinking, are we, as in here Aotearoa, New Zealand, are we producing too much food for the world? And are we producing too much logs? And if we didn't have that hell-bent on that, could our economy be a lot stronger long term if we said, okay, we're not going to just be focused on producing more and more food and actually actively find a way to produce less food?
Absolutely. That's the core of the issue, which is why my constant message to farmers as I engage them around the country is that future we have to have is the best opportunity that you're ever going to have, either in business or personal satisfaction or whatever. It's going to be the most profitable business you ever have. But it's, and so I'll give you an example. It is completely crazy that we plant lots of radiata pine. I'm not anti-radiata pine in itself. It grows very well here, and it's an okay wood. It's not a fantastic wood, but it's an okay wood. But it makes zero sense at all that a large chunk of that forestry gets harvested and gets shipped off as logs to China, where it goes into making packing cases and boxing for concrete, and then gets thrown away in order. And then all the slash that's left in on the decimated land delivers, for example, as it's just done for the second time in 4 years in Tolaga Bay, an absolute environmental disaster. So that makes no sense at all. But the economic drivers, and the sort of mindset of many in the forestry industry continues to drive them off that cliff. But they're taking the rest of us with them.
Yep.
The same thing with farming. Dairy farmers and sheep and beef farmers do an excellent job. But the job has changed massively since I grew up in the UK, and once a month we had a shoulder of frozen lamb from Canterbury for our Sunday roast. And not the least of which is there's an awful lot more animals around, and we haven't kept pace with how we make sure that those animals work with nature and not against it. So that we have got all of the problems that we now have. And last year I was up the Ashburton River interviewing a regenerative farmer who was doing a really interesting thing, a big corporate farmer on this one farm. They'd divided their large herd in two quite randomly, and their staff, to keep going with one set of practices while learning the other. And this particular farm manager had been on that farm for 12 years and the banks of the river had breached only 2 times in the previous 12 years it had been there, because they're right by the river. But when I visited him, it was just after the 4th breach in a month. So that's how much conditions are changing, and has to be a message about how fast we have to change. And we are really stuck economically, politically, socially, culturally on being able to make that really, really important shift to make sure that everything we do with our land, whether it's in forestry or farming or fisheries, works with nature and not against it. And so that's another one of my central preoccupations.
Yep. And I hear back from people when I have floated this idea, they say, but the world, we're short of food, the world needs more food. And I'm going, I don't think that's true. I think that's a fallacy.
It's completely, it's a word I wouldn't normally use, but it's complete bollocks. Because, first of all the food that's grown in the world, about 1/3 of it's wasted, thrown away, because we're not growing and consuming and disposing of food responsibly. So we could do that for starters, but that only fixes one problem. So the next problem is we have caused the climate change, and so crop yields are already falling. They have been for a while, and throwing more artificial fertilizer at that isn't going to change that. We're talking about deep climate change. The next thing is that so I've lost my train of thought there. I'm glad you're editing it. The next thing on food is, from a New Zealand point of view, is that I think this is a completely spurious number we use. I don't know how it's ever worked out, but we talk about feeding 40 million people. That's less than the population of Tokyo. So our supply of food is completely irrelevant. The far more interesting, and I would argue far more valuable economically in other ways, export we could be having is of the knowledge we have, or we don't have yet, but we need to develop, to be able to make sure everything we do works with nature and not against it. Because then far more people could benefit from that knowledge, and hopefully we would make money from it, than we could ever reach with more milk powder and more meat, however juicy and fresh the cut, or indeed however delightful the dairy dessert might be.
And you infuse that with Indigenous knowledge, because of our relationship with Māori, that is getting better and stronger, and our understanding of their practices, and producing food for 40 million people becomes insignificant when you look at the influence. Because I get so frustrated when people say it doesn't matter what we do here. I go, it absolutely does matter, because we are influential. People look to us around the world, and whether you like Jacinda or not, she was one of the most influential leaders in the world. People looked to her, and they know our record through COVID. They know all that stuff, and we are way more influential than people give credit for.
All that's completely true, but it's also fantastically important for us. We know lots of farmers are stressed by trying to make conventional farming systems continue to work. We know that some of these practices are very destructive, whether it's in forests or whether it's on land or whether it's on the water. We have to put these things right for ourselves and to the benefit to us. It's not just about being, good neighbours, good Samaritans out to the world. That's an important role too. But just for the sake of our own future here in this land, we have to get this right.
I had a phone call from one of our members down in Canterbury. He's towards the foothills, very, very good farmer. And he rang me last winter, and he's a lovely guy, and he said, Harv, fuck, I can't do this anymore. He said, this is all too hard. And he is hosting his collective intelligence team, all non-farmers, coming onto his farm, I think, in February or March. And it's just going, I've got to find a different way of doing this thing, because it's just too stressful, and it's just too stressful, this whole system. We don't have wriggle room, and it's just pressure the whole time now. And He's not a regenerative farmer, but it's interesting. He's got a person in his team who's into regenerative practices in other areas, and I guess the point is because I've also seen some regenerative farmers, Rod, out there who are not practicing it for themselves yet. So they're practicing it for the land, but there's still a lot of stress on themselves. They haven't been able to work out how to make it more enjoyable for themselves yet. They're still in some sort of spiral thing going on. I'm not sure what that's about. I think one in particular is an old habit. But, there's all sorts of things like that, Rod, that we need to just have different mindsets. And it's just, my frustration is this, we've just got this thing of the Fonterras and the dairy and the forestry industry has just been more, bigger scale, efficiency, and for what?
Absolutely.
It's just seems to be ingrained in us.
And yet, the wonderful thing is, we know some of the paths we can take. We don't know where they're going to lead us, but that's an important part of the journey. We know there are solutions that we can work on. So, I'm really stuck on the question of how do we actually get the initial change. Yes, you could encourage people, and so you can demonstrate, you can show them others that have started to take some steps. But in our agricultural sector, I think there are some very powerful voices who manage to keep pretty low profile. So they're not the president of Federated Farmers, who's just kind of an outspoken person, whoever he or she is, that kind of mouths what these other people are saying. And I've only got half an idea about who some of these people are, but I think they are very, very influential, both in organisations like Federated Farmers, in levy bodies like Dairy New Zealand, in co-ops like Fonterra, with very good political connections too. And I think there's probably quite a small bunch of people who are setting the tone and the agenda. I've thought about trying to work out who they are, but in the end, it's kind of like that's not a very good use of my time, because even if I could join dots and reveal who I think some of these people are, it's not going to change anything. I feel I'm more useful just being able to articulate what that future can be, has to be, in the hope that that encourages others to lock onto the issues. So it's a question of building awareness and support for those ideas, those imperatives, rather than sort of going after the people who are defending the status quo.
So, Rod, do you think you're very good at it?
No, I don't think I am. Sorry, let me
No, effective. Are you effective?
I have no idea, because it's kind of impossible to measure what I do. And I stopped trying to do that a long time ago. I mean, years ago, when I was at the Financial Times, I used to keep these ridiculous spreadsheets about how many front page stories I had and which were above the fold and which were below, and how many profiles. And I thought, well, that's reassuring me I'm doing a lot of work, and obviously my colleagues think this is fairly useful because I'm getting some stories on the front page, whatever. But that's not I'm not there to satisfy my colleagues. I was there to satisfy my readers. And I had, in those days, there was so little feedback, pre-social media. And so I just have no way of measuring how effective I am. The one thing that keeps me, two things keep me going. The first is, quite honestly, it's an incredibly selfish thing that keeps me going. I have this huge privilege that the way I earn a living is to be a journalist, work on these issues. unlike people who are, doctors, or they're running a business, or they're politicians, they've got these very busy jobs and they don't have an awful lot of time to think about all this kind of stuff. So I have this huge privilege that that's kind of all I do. My business model is ridiculously simple, and it more or less works in terms of earning a living. So the point is, though, that I have this huge privilege to spend my time doing these things and just trying to be as well-read, as thoughtful, as best connected I can be, as most articulate I can be, to be useful. I have no use. But then, essentially, it's very selfish because I'm doing it to try and make sense of the world for myself. And I do mean I'm using the words. Not that I'm a clinician, but I'm using them clinically. I think if I stopped processing, I'd probably go a bit crazy, quite honestly. I just feel sort of so overwhelmed. So the fact that I spend all my time trying to learn, trying to process, I think, keeps me... Well, I'll leave
moderately sane.
To judge how sane I am.
Yeah, moderately sane.
So that's the selfish side of it. But the positive side of it, and the sort of the far more important outreach side of it, is that I just find it amazingly reassuring that I run into people in all kinds of places that have read something I've written, or have heard something I've said on radio or whatever, and have thanked me for it. And there was literally a moment last week, the same day, where two different people that I'd never met before in their life both thanked me for that, and interestingly, both used the phrase that they felt I was grounded, which is very kind of them, because sometimes I feel not. But sorry, the basic point I'm making here is that I don't think there's any way of measuring what I do. I do it because I want to do it. I need to do it personally. And if I get and if that sounds very selfish, as it is, I know that I, do get enough feedback from people that's useful. And that's good, because I'm just trying to be useful.
Mm. Changing tack slightly, we last saw each other at the Oceania Egg Conference.
Yes, but then not to... Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to sequence this, because we also saw each other briefly at an Edmund Hillary Fellowship get-together in Wellington.
Oh, that's right.
But yeah.
That's right.
But indeed, and the Oceania Agritech Conference was a very useful one. Yeah.
Interesting, Rod, that... What I was so frustrated with that conference, because I know I think you were frustrated with it, that it wasn't talking about the hard issues enough. And he's shaking his head just so that was an issue. The issue for me is there were no young people there. They hadn't priced it and made it inclusive so young people could be there. So it was just like this a whole lot of middle-aged and older people there, right? But there were no teenagers, 20-year-olds there, If there was, it was just a handful. And I thought, we've got to get better at this and running events like this and making sure those voices are in the room and that they're able to access this information. Mm. Yeah, so I was really frustrated with that. And just going, it was not sort of same old type conference. I'm going, this is all too important now to have same old. It was like something out of 5 or 10 years ago.
It's I share those sentiments exactly. It was a very good conference, and it's right to be picking up on individual solutions, ways forward, new technologies, new initiatives. That's all good. There were some presentations which tried to weave more together. But I think it's really important in any of these conversations to have that overall context. But more important, and see how issues fit together. both in terms of problems and solutions. But most important of all, though, it's really, really important that we absolutely are steely-eyed about what's not working and really drill down into that. And that's what we keep aiming off from. It's too easy just to feel, oh, I came away from that conference feeling really hopeful because this, that, and the other was happening. And I come away from a conference thinking, well, yes, that's fine, but we've got these massive negative forces. We've got this massive baggage that we've got to deal with. We've got to take these hand in hand together. A thought occurs to me as we're talking. It would be kind of neat to have a conference whereby the fee was an inverse sliding scale based on your age. So if you're under 25, it's free. Given my age, I would hope there's some upper limit on that fee. But theoretically, those of us who are no longer paying a mortgage have more disposable income, so that therefore we can afford to pay more. But no, it's not just a question of the fee. It's, of course, making sure that people of wide perspective, of wide age, are fully represented in the programme, have speaking roles. So it's not just about who's sitting out there in the audience.
Mm. Yeah, I was frustrated. Here's an interesting thing. So the thing that really hit home for me was they talked about the biodiversity loss over the next, I think it was either 2050 or in the next 50 years. I couldn't remember which was which. But that basically 50% of the biodiversity was going to be lost in that period of time. On my way home, I called in to see a neighbour from that conference. I called in to see a neighbour about something, and she said, "Oh, what have you been up to, Harv?" And I said, "I've been at this thing." "Oh," and they're dairy farmers, and they said, "Oh, yeah, what came out of that?" And I talked about this biodiversity loss, and she just went, "Oh, rubbish." And I was like, "What?" And I thought, I didn't combat that. I just thought, I don't have the energy for this. And it was just, she was just like, "Oh, this is complete rubbish." And I made a comment that, oh, well, there were 350 people there, then didn't get their money's worth. So, I was just like, wow, don't want to have that conversation.
Yeah, it's always challenging. And I've only had a chance to do this once in a while. I don't immediately leap on that person and say, "You have no idea about species loss or biodiversity loss." And if we're talking about 50% loss from now where we are, it's like, how much have we lost again since mid-last century? The 1950s is a good benchmark. And but just to sort of say, "Oh, so what are you noticing, in your paddocks and in your rivers? What's going on? What do you remember when you were a child?" And just to try and get them to reflect a bit on their own observations, because their own observations, however much they've tried to suppress them, if they are honest, will reveal a lot to them.
And the great example is remembering as a kid on certain times of year, certain conditions, driving along with the windscreen would be just splattered with insects. And we don't, that's really rare now.
Do you, I must just say this because I just had to burst out laughing. When I read that analogy at one point, and my first response was, "Oh, it's just because cars are more aerodynamic these days." And I said, Ron, that is true, but it's not just the bugs being swept over the windscreen. There are less bugs, right? But I had to laugh at my first response. I wanted to find a reason that wasn't true, and I thought very slippery cars was a very good example.
Yeah. Plus we drive a whole lot faster now as well.
That's
and
right.
all of that.
So they're swept away.
All of that, yes. Yeah. No, it's a miracle of science. Okay, so I want to just go back to this interconnected thing, right? Because, all these things are, that's a topic that's really interested for me, because we often don't see that, how these things are interconnected, which is nature. And how we rely on these things. So I think that's something that, we've talked about in previous episodes. I said, what's the one thing that people could learn? And you said to fall in love with nature. That was a comment I think you made 2 years ago at the end of the podcast, and which comes back to the interconnectedness to me. They're all in the same space. Okay, what's the question? What do you think are the things that needs to change in this country in the near future? What are the things we need to focus on?
Again, this is in. I'm not trying to line up a pecking order here. I'm just trying to offer a few things across the piece. The first one is to remind ourselves that this is an extraordinarily beautiful piece of land, Aotearoa, and its surrounding waters. The next thing, if we want a bit of a sort of historic perspective on this was the last landmass to be settled by humans, probably only about 32, 3, 4, 5 generations ago. When the first people arrived here, this was nature untouched by humans. Even when Banks was here with Cook, quite a bit later, now just about 250 years ago, and talked about the extraordinary, dawn chorus in the bush and all the rest. So completely untouched by nature. But however, in various parts of our ecosystems, we've pulled off one of the fastest degradations of those ecosystems that's been. So we have done in a few hundred years, more like 150 years, huge damage that took perhaps 1,000 years to do across Europe, for example. Although it also, the American colonists were very good at fast degradation too. But then the last thing is we have not just these remnants of wonderful endemic species and landscapes, but we have this continuous knowledge, this continuous indigenous knowledge from pristine to deeply degraded in the world, probably one of the best continuous knowledge. We also we're kind of at the forefront, we are at the forefront of indigenous knowledge working with Western science, if you like, Māori and Mataranga Pākehā, to find these solutions. So all 11 of the National Science Challenges are empowered to bring the two together. And it's amazing because it's not about indigenous knowledge being something fixed that you hark back to. It's about a way of observing, understanding, remembering, and to help take that knowledge on. And I'm very intrigued. So, for example, in the IPCC, the United Nations Climate Change Science Organization, increasingly in their reports, there is, in the AR5 assessment report, 6, the latest one, AR6, there's extensive work there about the power of indigenous knowledge. And so that's a big sort of historic context for us to remember, that we have, and we should be able to remember enough about how this place was to be able to want to reclaim that, help nature come back. We will never get back to where that was. Nature goes off in a different direction. It only moves forward, but moves forward in a far more sort of wholesome and regenerative way. So that's a whole big first thing. The second one is that we are a very small country, so 5 million people. I would never want to try to pull off this feat in a larger country, and it's very noticeable if you look at the annual democracy index of the Economist Intelligence Unit. Almost all the countries in the top 10 are populations that are barely double digits millions. Yep. I think that's really important. So we need to remind ourselves that in a country of 5 million people, however separated we are, and however fractured we are, atomizing into these, minuscule groups of people, we can bring that together, back together. And that's very hard. I don't know how to do that. The sort of work you do with collective intelligence, bringing people together, is obviously one example of that. So that's the second thing. But then the third thing is that because those are essentially self-centered, selfish responses, the third one is to take very seriously that we're part of a global community and we have something to contribute. And one of my sadnesses, I'm trying to think if that's the right word. Yes, it is. One of the things that does make me sad is that I feel we are less effective, we are less articulate about ourselves out on the world stage than I think we were, say, about 10 years ago. I think that reflects how much we've been turning in on ourselves here in New Zealand. There's obviously if, buts and ands around that. You can offer counterfactual arguments. But that's my sense too. So those would be the three things. It's understanding how extraordinary this place is that we call home. Secondly, understanding that the only way that we're going to put this right is to find new ways to connect, to work together, amidst all these amazingly awful and challenging pressures on us from the out-of-control side of social media and the rest. And then thirdly, to make sure that what we're doing is not intensely selfish in itself, what we're doing within the country, within our communities, but we're always reaching out more broadly and understanding what we can usefully contribute in our small way to the world.
So something that I've been pondering over the break, it came from some reading, is that I am indigenous to this planet. And I'm not indigenous to these islands, but I'm indigenous to the planet. And I need to work harder in thinking about where I've come from and start thinking more like an indigenous person of the planet.
Wow, that is a fabulous thought. And I think it helps hugely. I hope it would help people who feel that they are alienated by talk of Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge, and just need to step back from that. And a very good. So thank you. That's very helpful.
And it came from a conversation with Che Wilson, a good mate, who I talked to a while ago, and he talked about, and it was so we had that conversation 12 months ago, and then it seeded, and he said, Harv, if you go back far enough, if you go back to where you've come from, France and the UK, the practices back there, he said, Che's Māori, and he said, when I go back there and I look at the ancient pagan type practices, and I go, I feel at home here. And so that's something that I'm trying to work on myself and go, okay, so I'm not Indigenous here, but I am Indigenous on this planet. And so to try and I don't know what it's, I'm just really interested with that mindset and what it could do for how I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but it feels good.
Oh, I think it would feel really good, and I relate to it very strongly. Of course, the challenge for all of us is to feel that what I do isn't really the least bit important, because I'm only one of 8 billion people on the planet, and what difference is that going to make? And the way I think about that is that each of us can only do this infinitesimally small thing, But if kind of an almost infinite number of us do our infinitesimally small thing, and it has some congruity and lines up and some collective force, then we make very big change. In terms of indigeneity, one of my favourite writers is John Muir, who is really important and has become really important in my life. He was born in Dunbar in Scotland in the mid-19th century. And his family, with him as one of the children, went to the States as immigrants. And he became, in the States, as an adult, one of the leaders of the original environmental movement. So he, for example, he was one of the founders of the Sierra Club. And he took Teddy Roosevelt camping in Yosemite and persuaded him to create the system of national parks. But Muir is so fascinating because in his writings, he's got a collection of 7 wilderness journey books. He talks about that sense of interconnectedness, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he has one of the very memorable quotes is that every time we try to pluck at a single thing, we find it connected with the rest of the universe. So there's that sense of deep interconnection. And so for me, Muir's really interesting because he's white, Scottish, stroke American, and yet he says things that Indigenous people anywhere would recognise. There's this old party game of, who would you like to have dinner with if you could bring them back for a night? And I have a slight variation. There's who would I like to take to a marae?
Right. Yep.
And I would love to bring Muir back for a day and go to a marae and just see what kind of good old kororo he had with the people on that marae. They would be like brothers.
Yep. Rod, just going back to a comment you made before, with collective intelligence, what we are finding at the moment is that more and more new members, so all our whole model is around diversity, putting together people who wouldn't normally mix and understanding that. We understand a fraction of what actually goes on, but we know it's major. What we're finding with some new members is that they're struggling with the diversity when they're coming in. Mm. They don't get it. They are craving to be with people more like themselves. So we talk about the fact they're going to be with people who are different to them, and they go, yeah, that's good, until they go into the team. And it's taking a bit more time to settle people into the fact of that discomfort that you're going to be with people who you're not going to agree with initially, or might not agree with ever, but that's okay. You've got different views of the world. And I'm seeing that more now than we've seen in the past. And I think it's that what we've come through in the last 12 or 18 months is that people are seeking more comfort in their world, and our process eventually gives comfort, but it's, I'm seeing more of that, seeing more tribalism.
That's very intriguing, and I can absolutely know that would be the case because what we're seeing in society at large. And I'm not underestimating for a moment how difficult it is to pull this off, but I'm sure you're all learning fast on this and how to do it, is to be able to get to know, relate to, encourage those people to begin to experience how that works and how much comfort there is, how much reassurance, how much excitement, exhilaration there is in finding ways to make connection with people who seem quite different from you. And I just think it's an amazing moment in human relationships when you get that first glimmer with a person you've only just met, and you think, go real chalk and cheese here. How on earth I don't have the time for this.
And I'm supposed to hang out with
yeah.
you for a day and a half
Yeah.
in this intimate environment. It's just like, and I'm paying money for this. It's just taking time away to be involved in this. Yeah.
I wish you and all of your colleagues all the very best in that, because I think that is one of the absolute keys for us as to learn how to do that across society. I mean, there'd be many ways to do it. So there's a whole bunch of old skills we need to resurrect, new skills and new ways of doing things that we can make that happen. But it is that ability to connect that seems and connect well, that seems so weak and these days. And
we also know that connecting doesn't mean agreeing. And so we had somebody join recently, a very, very smart woman. She was a bit unsettled by it. And I said, but you didn't tell anybody. And she said, I didn't want to upset anybody.
Yeah.
I said, well, it's okay to upset people. You're not there, it's okay to do that. And with my team, we met before that I'm in. Personally, we met before in early December, last meeting. It was the most profound meeting we've ever had. And we really pushed each other. There was a magic 2-hour period, and I was just, everybody said, why are you smiling so much? I said, because that was magic. And it was just the sheer pressure that the team put on each other in a moment, and there was some wonderful outcomes came from that. But then afterwards, some people found it, it was too uncomfortable. And so then we've got to do a bit of work to get that settled down. But I think, in society, we're just at the moment, and I think it's showing up in all sorts of ways. But anyway, it's a new challenge for us right now, is that people are going, yes, I want the diversity, but no, I don't want that much diversity. It's too much. And we are getting more diverse as we go on, and we're attracting more change makers, which is interesting. And so, as all that happens, it's making our job harder in other ways, and yet the outcomes will be greater. It's a funny space we're in right now.
I have no doubt that in that sort of restless ingenuity that is one of the great hallmarks of humanity, and that you as a community, you all will find great ways through that.
I'd like some comfort right now, Rod. It's interesting how much for me I'm going, this is great, but I am seeking some comfort, and yet I know we are in this really wonderful space right now that we're going through this metamorphosis, and yet I know I'm going, I'd like some comfort just for, just go, okay, stick with it.
Yep.
Yeah. It's
very, very human, very natural.
Yeah. So, Rod, what these 4 things? No, here's a question. Are we on track to what you want to talk about?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy with all that. Yep.
Okay, all right. So these 4 things we've got down here, the economics, the politics, society and living earth here. While you think about that, no, I'm going to put a bonus question in here. What was your highlight last year? What was your highest point last year? The thing that thrilled you the most?
Have your pause, because there were some wonderful moments last year. Let me give you I'll tell a story. Inevitably, there's a story. So I went to COP28, the climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. 40,000 people there from around the world. One evening, I'm on a shuttle bus back to my hotel, and I found myself chatting to the person sitting next to me. His name was George. George is from the shores of Lake Victoria in Kenya. He was telling me that he had been a national member of parliament in Nairobi for a couple of decades, and he was later in his career and thought, well, that was all very well, but things getting too urgent back home. So, lovely testament to colonialism, they call their local government units counties. So he's the elected leader of a county of 1.3 million people on the shores of Lake Victoria. Climate change is a very real thing for them. So up in the hills, 40 or 50 kilometres back from the lake, huge rain that they've never had before. So the lake level of Lake Victoria has risen 2 metres. But there's drought alongside Lake Victoria. So they've got flooding, but no way to get the water into the fields other than the deluge. He points out that in a country like theirs, there is not a great deal of help and money flowing from central government to local government. So it's kind of entirely up to them to kind of work out what to do, which is why he'd come to Sharm el-Sheikh. And to have those conversations, because what's I think not fully appreciated about COP is that yes, there are the really important political negotiations, but it is also a hui of humanity.
Yep.
In terms of an amazing array of people there. And so his insight, his humility as a leader, his energy to come looking for things to take home was for me emblematic of all the good stuff in the world. And I haven't been back in touch with George because in my excitement I never did ask him for a card, and I've been meaning to do this and I will. There can't be too many counties with about 1.3
Yep.
million people around Lake Victoria. I'm sure I can track him down, and I intend to, because I want to hear what he's been up to since he got home. So that's an international story, but that's one that, the essence of that story applies to each of us here. It's not about going overseas to find some great insight or something else, but it's that sense of commitment, that the humility, the restlessness, the innovation in terms of trying to solve intractable issues, and trying to get together the ideas, the people, the resources to make those changes. So yeah, that to me would be one of my favourite moments from last year.
For me, it was the Soccer World Cup and the Japanese players and fans, and just how they would tidy everything up, and they were just such wonderful citizens. And I just thought, you talked about the humility and so forth, and I just looked at them and I thought, there is so much to learn from them in that respect, and the way they would clean the stands afterwards in the crowds and so forth. And it's just going, that's what a culture can do, And I was just like, it was, and they played good soccer. I'm not a soccer fan, but that was something I just thought, it's a great reminder what collectively we can do when the culture says this is the way you treat each other. Yeah. What was your thing that bugged you the most last year?
I'm glad this is being edited, only because I need to have a big long think about it. It's a really interesting question. I'm the long pause is because I haven't really ever sort of tried to line up such a thing. And I'm going to be very careful in my answer because I don't want to jeopardize a relationship that I think might eventually work. But it's essentially this. It's about dairy farming. It's about leadership in dairy farming. And it's about the inability so far of key leaders to really front up to what their responsibilities are as the largest as a sector, the largest single sector in terms of source of emissions. And this was somebody who I've known a little bit for a long time, and I was hoping to be able to have a conversation with, and I spotted a piece of news that gave me a good reason to text this person. And I got basically trying to just sort of reopen the conversation, the channels. And I got an okay response to that, but it hasn't gone anywhere over the last few months, and I don't know whether it will. But I'm not blaming that person because they have huge amounts of pressure on them. If anything, I feel that the responsibility is mine, that I'm not more skilled, I'm not more adept at trying to build relationships, but the inability to have a conversation that I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm just wanting to, put some thoughts out there that I think could be helpful. So that was very very disappointing. And it's not the end of the story. Eventually, we might be able to get together to have that conversation. But it doesn't sound major in itself. But there are so many of the issues that I really wrestle with involved in that story, that I thought there was a glimmer of hope, and I reached out to try to kindle it some more, and it hasn't worked. So that to me is that was very disappointing.
And I think that's a really important example, because from what I'm hearing, that you were trying to help. And it comes down to this thing, how do we bring these differing views together to solve bigger problems, right? And so my disappointing thing last year, the thing that really annoyed me, was my reaction to groundswell. And I was so judgy and so disappointed with the farming sector, so judgy, the whole thing. And I thought of how do I help her? And it was like all of my resources just disappeared, and I just resorted to being judgy. And I was disappointed in groundswell, but I was more disappointed in my inability to engage with it. And I was just so frustrated, and this great big gap opened up, And I went down to watch it in my local town of Fielding, and the utes are going through, and I'm just sitting there, and I had a conversation with a farmer who was standing there. It didn't go well, It was just like, and I thought, and it was just this great big gap opened up. And I was just so frustrated with not being able to, be more engaged with it.
That's really intriguing, because we're essentially touching on the same issue. Yeah, in the same sector. And it was
just, and I thought, wow, okay, this is a great void here. I wasn't trying to help, Rod, just to be clear. As I said, I was just resorted to schoolboy, bloody judgy stuff, and very, And I thought, okay, that's not going to work. And so that lasted a few days, and I was just like, got to find a different way. Haven't found it, but that's something I am really grappling with. So what are the big opportunities going forward? right, for us this coming year as a nation?
I always have to, in trying to find answers to perfectly legitimate questions like that, to differentiate between what I really, really hope will happen versus what I think is possible, practical. Now, it's not just a question about me being idealistic versus, realistic, but I'm just trying to make sure that it's not my personal preoccupations which are sort of driving the agenda. So that's a bit of a disclaimer on that. I'm going to say something that sounds so simplistic, so so soft in a sense, that I would just really hope that we can use the very important moment of this year's election campaign to achieve a better, more useful level of discourse and exchange of ideas than we have achieved for a very long time. I don't know that that's possible. It feels very, very, very difficult. But that's the main thing I'd love to see. There I go, that I'd love to see happen. Perhaps I'll try and phrase it just that would be a very good first step in making sure we are making the most of our opportunities and beginning to move on from those things that have been dogging us very badly.
And what are our opportunities?
Well, it comes back to us being a small, potentially well-connected country, both internally and externally, in an amazing part of the world in ecosystem and natural senses, to be very fully engaged in this enterprise of humanity to make sure that we everything we do works with nature, not against it. And that sounds awfully wafty, whatever, lofty, but that to me is the absolute heart of it. And again, speaking from a personal point of view, one of the reasons I shouldn't say my family, because our daughter was only 6 years old at the time, and although she was part of the discussion, she wasn't thinking in these terms about coming to New Zealand. But it was something that Lynn and I considered very carefully, that we felt that in moving to New Zealand and taking up the offer of a job here for me, that we were trading in scale for dimension. So in London, we were doing large-scale things in our own professions, but the elements of our life weren't that very well connected. So most of our friends were journalists or actors, and we didn't know a wider, more connected community. And although we both felt we were doing good work in our professions, the idea of coming to New Zealand to trade in that large scale, but instead gain dimension, so less two-dimensional, more three-dimensional, we thought was really interesting. And one of our measures of that would be that our friends would be far more diverse than we had in London, because we had that sort of greater connection between the various spheres of our lives, and that's exactly how it's been. And so, just at a personal level, Aotearoa has been completely remarkable for us over this now 25 years, coming up to 26 years. And it's been very fascinating for our daughter, who was 6 at the time when she arrived here and just absolutely glommed onto New Zealand. It was quite extraordinary. and it's hugely influenced her. And by her early 20s, she had finished university here and then was overseas. She stays in close touch. She has been back for periods, but the nature of her work means that she will likely be overseas for the indefinite future. But I find it completely fascinating, the way that this place has had with her in terms of shaping who she is as a person and shaping the work that she does. So I'm speaking in very personal terms here. I'm happy to talk about them. But that's what feels so special about this country, this community or community of communities that we are in this country, in this part of the world, and that's what means so much to me, but also and as a consequence, keeps renewing, keeps refreshing my energy and my hope.
Mm. Mm.
Sorry, that's a kind of a rambling answer. But I think I know I'm quite a different person than if I'd just sort of stayed in the UK. This place has had its way with me in very beneficial measures.
I just reflecting on that, Rod. I've got a nephew who lives. I don't know where he lives. Somewhere in the UK. I do know. Anyway, so and his mother. So his mother's my sister. She's lived there forever. And what's interesting, he's coming out this year for the first time in a long time. But New Zealand has a big influence on him, even though he's not. It's interesting. I see the influence that it has on him, and indirectly, and his outlook on life and so forth is different than if both parents had come from the UK. And he's immensely proud of having that heritage back to New Zealand, and yeah, it's really interesting just to see that come through. And he's bringing his children here for the first time, which is in March, April, which is going to be really interesting. So it is a fascinating country, and I'm really interested talking about when you talked earlier that how the Pacific people, when they come here, they retain that identity very, very strongly, and that I'd never thought about that how important that is, that we don't lose that. And I grew up in Pahiatua. My mother taught at the Polish camp, and I just saw a post recently about one of the children who was literally born in a concentration camp in World War II, and then ended up here as a very, very young person, and then his career went on as a singer and so forth and all that sort of thing. But absolutely still identifies very, very strongly with that Polish heritage and so forth. And so when you're talking about that, I think that is an important part of that we seem to have managed, and maybe it's because we haven't had the generations or the hundreds of years to dominate the cultures coming in. Rod, anything we've missed this morning?
I think we've ranged fairly widely about
We have.
life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to borrow from the American Constitution.
You've been in a lot more reflective mood in other years, Rod, than yeah.
No, thank you. That's actually an interesting observation, because I'm trying to process some things about, how I might change my role or what I might do. I in a sense, have a deadline. Come June of 2025, I would have been a business journalist for 50 years. And I'm quite determined to get there. I know it's only a count of the years. It's not, which means nothing. But more importantly is just, just trying to keep checking that how is there something new and different I could do to try and be more useful or whatever. So this is a very reflective time for me. I, in one sense, I'm constantly reflecting, but yeah, we'll see where this takes me.
And I think just on that mode that you're in of reflection, Rod, because it's interesting, normally, no, not normally, other years you've been very clear on the things, clear on your views. This year you're less clear on your views or less sure or less forceful on your views. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I know what part of that is, that as I think through any issue, years ago I could be quoting all kinds of policy at you, and if we do this, and this, it's all going to be, it's going to make a big difference. And we're trying to deal with such complicated issues that all fit together. And I can never, ever be, nor do I want to be, any kind of expert in any of them. What I'm constantly trying to do is to find ways to bring things together, to kind of synthesize things, or to connect things. And so to do that, I feel that it's kind of necessary to think through things down to the core issues, the core considerations. But that's fine. But you get at some point, what I worry about is that at some point I get to some point of reduction where I'm left saying things like, I'm kind of making this up as I go along, love is everything, or there's something in that. But it's at some point I cease being useful because I've distilled things too much.
I think that's a stunning statement. Well, because I think that's a really interesting statement, because once you've distilled them so much, then how can other people come and play with you? Because you're right, you're the expert. And I've read a lot of your work, and you have come across as the expert many, many times to me. And there's, I hope there's no judgment say that. I'm just going, and it's interesting watching you now being a lot more less decisive and clear in your thinking. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, thank you.
Not that, in my opinion, matters a damn, but if I think to our good friend Anarchy Goodall, right? And Anarchy is so good at keeping lots of different avenues open all at once, and I think that's a real skill, without losing himself or not losing, where his values are and all that sort of carry on. And I think, for a skill going forward, Rod, of being able to keep multiple channels open at the same time for as long as is necessary. And I know with our work with collective intelligence, we try and encourage the teams, don't get to the answer, keep it open for as long as possible and see what else arrives. Because the first answer is not always and then the answer is, often not that important. It's actually what's the next question, where we're going next, and it's but I know from where I've come from, knowing the answer and being decisive and all that sort of, we get our jollies from that, and we get prestige from that.
Yeah.
And let's go and interview Rod. He's got no idea what he's talking about, but he's not clear. But so no, I think it's been a fascinating. I've enjoyed this conversation more than any other, Rod, because watching you grapple today, and we don't edit this, so that all those pauses are going to be there because they're real. I think it would be a disservice to take those out, because that is you reflecting, that is you working to try and work this thing out.
Well, thank you. And thank you to anybody who listens and hangs in there with us right to the end.
And believe it or not, people actually listen to this shit, Rod. So, okay, let's sign off. Rod, thank you for your time. Always enjoy it. It's a great privilege for me to dig into your head and see what's going on. And I look forward to next year and the year after, and celebrate your 50 years in journalism, and have a wicked year.
Well, thank you. And just absolutely all the same to you and everyone in the collective intelligence community as you thrive and grow, and bring your very special culture and skills to all of these things we've been talking about.
Kia ora, Rod. Thank you.
Kia ora.
Thanks for listening in. We're Collective Intelligence, a one-of-a-kind people ecosystem that takes inspiration from Mother Nature. To find out how we reimagine leadership development, visit our website www.collectiveintelligence.co.nz.